I'm thrilled to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Salida Reynolds, who is a general manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, second largest municipal transportation agency in the country. She's responsible for 1,300 employees and 52 different business lines, from parking meters to traffic signals to buses. Reynolds was appointed by Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti in 2014 to implement the mayor's vision of safe and sustainable transportation choices for all. Under Reynolds' leadership, LADOT has installed hundreds of data-driven safety improvements in high-needs locations, launched the largest scooter program in the world, launched the largest electric vehicle share program in the country, and created a first-of-its-kind digital platform to manage for-profit mobility companies. Salida is also a thought leader and change agent, and one of the most respected transportation minds in America. So with this, I'm honored to have her present here in Milwaukee and look forward to hearing from her experiences and learning from her on what we can be doing better in our community. So welcome, Salida.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and everybody for inviting me to share this morning with you. I'm so excited and was thrilled to get an invitation from my old friends, Mike Amsden and Dr. Bob Schneider, a couple of folks who I've worked closely with over many years in many different roles. And for those who see the world differently than I do, I am a middle-aged white lady with long wavy blonde hair, and my pronouns are she and her. So for those of you tuning in, you're probably sort of wondering to yourself, well, you know, what is Los Angeles is nothing like Milwaukee. What is this middle-aged white lady with long blonde wavy hair doing in our conference? And I'll just share that Los Angeles is a huge city, and it contains almost every type of place that you can imagine. There are parts of the city where my primary concern is equestrian and horse crossings, and there are parts of the city that are the densest neighborhoods west of Manhattan. And so, you know, if you've got a street in Milwaukee, I've probably got one that looks just like it in Los Angeles. And the thing I want to open with, and hopefully you can carry this with you in your work, which is so critically important, are the things that I try and carry with me every day that guide my work. And that's three words: vision, pragmatism, and joy. These are the underpinnings of all of the work that we've done in Los Angeles. And I hope that you can see what that looks like and what that means when we bring it to life on the ground. So I'm going to start, go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully you can all see it. There we go. And, you know, I actually went to college for American history. I graduated as a history major. I had really no background or training in urban planning or transportation engineering. And through a series of very lucky and happy accidents, found myself as the bicycle parking coordinator for the city of Oakland in 1998 as my first job out of college, because it will surprise none of you to know that there are not a lot of jobs for history majors. So you have to kind of hustle hard and find where you fit in. But I bring that sensibility to everything that I do. I'm always curious, how did things get the way they are? How did we, you know, end up with the cities that we have, with the streets that we have, with the neighborhoods that we have? This is an image from around 1910. This could have been taken in any city in the United States around this same time. This happens to be Market Street in downtown San Francisco. And you'll notice a couple things about this image. First of all, people are walking wherever and whenever they want. Second of all, there's still a horse-drawn carriage, which, you know, the equivalent of Jeff's department, the Public Works Department, would have had as its primary concern cleaning up horse manure off the streets at this time. People are primarily moving by streetcar, but you can see the advent of the disruptive technology of that time, which was the internal combustion engine, and the automobile is showing up in the image as well. The speed of this street was streetcar It was around 8 miles an hour. There was a lot of other things going on in the United States at this time, but this is sort of what cities looked like and where we started. And one of the things to take away as I sort of run through these images is that one of the only constants in a city is change. And when you look at a street and you encounter a community conversation about how to change that street, it can feel very threatening to people because it can feel to them like that street as it exists today is the way that it always has been. And a key component to sparking people's imagination is helping to open their eyes that that's not true. This is an image of, in just a few short years later, from looking at downtown Los Angeles. That building in the pointy building there, the tallest building in the city is City Hall. And you can see this is an image from the 1960s. So this is the decade when we dismantled our last cable car line in the city of Los Angeles, in favor of what began under the Eisenhower administration, a huge national infrastructure program to lay down what was then seen as a huge sign of American ingenuity, American progress, and American power in the world, which was our national highway system. But we made a couple of critical mistakes when we built this system. The first is that instead of going around our downtowns, we decided to take our freeway system right through the middle of them. And the second is that because of that first mistake, we were required to bulldoze and demolish neighborhoods that had been existing in the footprint of this huge piece of infrastructure. It is no coincidence that those neighborhoods were largely inhabited by Black Angelenos and other ethnic minorities that had no access to power and that had been redlined out of home ownership anywhere else in our city. In downtown Los Angeles today, we have neighborhoods that are surrounded by 5 different freeways. And if you are a child in Boyle Heights, just to the east of this photo, the number one reason why you miss school is because of childhood asthma. And when your mom or your dad has to take a day off of work to take 2 or 3 buses to get you to critical care, they might lose their job. And they're also having to do that because they don't have access to medical insurance. These cascading societal failures all live and come home to roost in your transportation system. And this is what a hangover from a freeway building binge looks like. It looks like hundreds of hours lost in traffic every single year. In California, it looks like the leading cause of climate change. And for those of you who've been paying attention, we in California have run through our entire snowpack already, and summer hasn't even begun. And so we are in store for a very long and very grueling fire season. We know that car crashes are the #1 cause of death for children in LA County, and that is true across the United States and many other cities. And there's an economic cost. You can reach so many more jobs if you own a car. And if you've been denied access to credit or a bank account, you can't afford a car, that means that your economic mobility is stunted. The other challenge for us is that a person in a car takes up a lot more than their fair share of space in a limited public right-of-way. You all know that we cannot widen roads to solve congestion. We don't have the room to do it. It's very expensive and it doesn't work. So we are no longer in the business of really increasing the amount of real estate that we dedicate to people driving, which means we now have a fixed ceiling on the amount of space that we have to move people in our region. And that has implications for everything that we love about cities that make them thrive. The challenge then for us is to take a step back and figure out how we could do something differently. The reasons why people don't own cars are many and varied, but the fact remains is that we have invested, far over invested in infrastructure for people who have access to this really critical device that can move them around and get them where they need to go. But we have done a really poor job in accounting for the externalities, the negative externalities of those choices. This is because for many decades, the way that engineers and planners measured the success of our streets was really about how many vehicles you could move, how quickly, and or sort of ironically, how safe those same streets were. So can we move a lot of cars really fast, but also make sure that we are keeping safety in mind and that the safety record of those same streets is not one where people are getting injured and killed. If you had an asset in business and you didn't do anything different with it for 50 years, you would be out of business. And that is what we are slowly realizing, is that our streets are public space. In most cities, streets alone account for about 15 to 20% of the overall public space in those cities. Those streets belong to you, just like parks, just like schools, just like City Hall. Those streets are owned by the people who live in those cities and in those places. And the parking that we use to store private automobiles is the same. There are 200 square miles devoted to parking in LA County. As we confront an unprecedented housing crisis, as we confront challenges around making sure that we have adequate space for public schools and all of the other amenities that we need for people to have a thriving quality of life, we can no longer afford to measure our streets through that lens. They have to do more heavy lifting. They have to be places where we deliver excellent public health outcomes. They have to be places that support businesses. They have to be places where we begin to turn the tide on climate change. And they have to be places that directly address their legacy of racial and socioeconomic inequality. As we think about the potential of all of this space, and we consider how we might use it differently, we think about opportunities to begin to expand and change both the number of people who have access to the space and the way that they use it. And as we've done these projects in downtown LA, they were some of the very beginnings, the very first things that we did on our own journey to try and change the way that we design and deliver our streets. What we found is that people really love them. They became a place for community. They became a place for joy. They became a place for connection, for community happiness, for social cohesion, things that a parking space cannot deliver. The challenge is that for many small business owners, the margins that they work under are so slender, and they feel as though having a parking space right in front of their business is critical to their survival. And as I put this results of this study up on the screen, I think it's important to remember that there are also, when a small business owner sees this, they might get excited about the potential. When a community resident sees this, they might think about something else. They might think about displacement, about gentrification, about whether or not the street is for them anymore. So it is critical that all of those stakeholders are involved in these discussions. But whether you are in Iuka, Mississippi, or you're in Los Angeles, California, small businesses remain the backbone and the heartbeat of most places. And their success or failure can be the beginning of a cascade of success that really helps a community and a neighborhood thrive and rise. And it's important to break this narrative that parking and vehicles are the main pathway to that success, because as we've seen repeatedly, they aren't. So, when I got to Los Angeles in 2014, the city was just beginning its journey. The mayor had just been elected. His first executive directive was called Great Streets for Los Angeles. And so I set out to try and think, how am I going to tackle this huge challenge? 7,500 miles of streets in the city of Los Angeles. And when I say LA, most of you probably think about, maybe you think about beaches and palm trees, maybe you think about Kardashians, But what you probably think about most dominantly is cars. You think about congestion, you think about Los Angeles as being the car capital of the world. And while we have a transit system that moves millions of people every day, we also have a deeply embedded car culture and a deep connection to the car as a symbol of independence and access to opportunity that bears itself out in the data. So how are we going to begin to tackle this particular challenge in a place like LA? So we started with Broadway. This is Broadway in downtown LA. Although you wouldn't know it by the way that the space is allocated, this street moves more people on foot and on bike than it does cars. And so we had to start to help people think about the street in a different way. So we started by throwing a lot of parties, to be honest. This is a ciclovia on Broadway. Ciclovia is an open streets event, and it's hard to underestimate the power of the excitement and happiness that people feel when they get to see the street from a different perspective, when they get to see these beautiful historic buildings from behind the handlebar of their bikes or whatever mobility device they're using in the middle of the street, rather than enclosed in their car or stuck on the sidewalk. Then we made some strategic partnerships. The Department of Cultural Affairs and LADOT have worked really closely together from the very beginning. We enlisted the city's poet laureate to put poetry up on abandoned marquees. We brought in artists to do drop-down murals. In this case, Biddy Mason, Gabrielle Figueroa, the city's mother and father, as a way to get people to startle them out of their routine way of thinking about Broadway, of thinking about downtown LA. Cute kids don't hurt. These are my kids. This is several years ago. They look really different now. But it's really important that streets and places be exciting and enticing to people of all ages. And then we did the project. We took out a lane of traffic and we gave it over to uses like this all along this corridor. This is not an expensive project. These are bollards, these are planters, these are umbrellas. These are things that we were able to put out pretty quickly. And through a relatively modest investment along this corridor, it goes from 1st Street to 11th Street. So it goes for several blocks through downtown. We've seen millions of dollars of reinvestment since we put this project in the facades of the building, in the number of businesses that are now, the storefronts that are activated along this street. This is Grand Central Market. This is now a key tourist destination and a huge draw for people when they come and visit the city of LA. And so for us, it was a worthwhile investment, and it was worth it to persist through the initial pushback from drivers, from some of the businesses along the street that didn't think it was going to work. It's still in place today, and it's thrived even during the pandemic. So we decided we would go and take this idea to other places and other streets. This is Cesar Chavez in Boyle Heights. So we put out a call, instead of taking our money and marching into a community and saying, we're from the government and we're here to help. Instead, we asked the community to tell us how they would re-envision and bring a sense of their community identity to their streets. Relatively small dollar amounts here. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we spread it around the city, because it's important to always remember that, number one, people don't trust government, because number two, we're the ones that put down the freeways that surround Boyle Heights. And so in a spirit of atonement, we began thinking about how could we create an investment opportunity that communities could then take advantage of. And this is what they did. They worked to put in quotes around the temporary curb extensions that we put in place. They built places for people to sit. They activated those with mariachis, with artists, and they actually brought their message to the street itself, for people to look down at the pavement beneath their feet and think differently about how they might use it. Latino urbanism is something that's really important in Los Angeles. It's critical to our identity as really a huge melting pot of cultures from all around the world. And the Zocalo is a really critical part of that urbanism in places like Mexico City, the public square where gathering happens. And the street is what we're saying is the place where we can make that happen. So, we put in these simple changes, and it's amazing how a little bit of paint and some plastic bollards will send an entirely different message about who matters in this space and who is a guest. And so we carried this sort of all along this multi-block stretch of Cesar Chavez. And this street is now going to receive millions of dollars of grant funds to redo the sidewalks and to put these in permanently in concrete. We went to South LA. This is Crenshaw and Florence, another perennial top 10 in the most dangerous places where we see the largest number of crashes in the city of LA. And what the community decided to do with this space was to take literally spray chalk and create a giant crisscross crosswalk here so people could parade in their street. They made piano keys out of the crosswalks, and they created opportunities for arts and culture and music at every corner. So on the right-hand side is the Festival of Masks, parading through the street and blessing it. In the middle are some teenagers who are making beats at a machine that was installed that runs off of the power from the traffic signal. At the other corner, there was a DJ. At another corner, there was a pianist. At another corner was a place you could sit on a street bench and actually make music. So two people sitting next to each other, one of whom had the percussion and the other had the melody. And so you can see how these opportunities are really, it's not so much about the design of the street. The design of the street itself is a backdrop. And the backdrop is there to enable people to really telegraph to the drivers who are moving through this intersection that this is the heart of their neighborhood. This is their living room. This is where they come together. This is where they create. This is where they are able to be proud of the community that they represent. So we decided we would take that idea to other places. This is Hollywood and Highland in the middle of the Walk of Fame in Los Angeles. This is our front door. It's also a place where people were getting injured or killed once a month because it's a big time intersection. It moves a lot of traffic and it moves a lot of people on foot. So we put in a scramble crosswalk here. And, this is where we roll out our red carpet. This is where people get an opportunity to be in the middle of the street, to see this iconic intersection, to gaze down the street at the Pantages Theater and all of these historic locations. It's also the place where we've only had one injury in the 5 years since we put this in place. So there are also dozens of people who've made it home to their families because of a little white paint and some signal timing changes. This project cost less than $100,000. So we decided we would take this idea a little further. We were getting excited about the idea that we could use streets differently, and we took the same approach and put out a call for people to tell us, where would you install maybe permanent plazas? This is South LA in front of the Vision Theater, and this is what this intersection or what the street now looks like. People bring out basketball hoops, they bring out drums, they bring out stages. This is the iconic Vision Theater. This is a really important cultural monument for South LA. And you can see this is also a place where there was tremendous pent-up demand for people to be able to come together. Those are West African art symbols in the dots on the ground. This is a unique design that the community brought to us and that we were able to facilitate and bring to life. This is Bradley Plaza in Van Nuys in the Valley in Pacoima. This is North Hollywood, another plaza in the Valley. This is Polka Dot Plaza in Silver Lake. So we were, working on these big time streets, but we also wanted to think about the smaller sort of neighborhood interventions and activations. And so I had been on a study tour and had encountered the idea of a play street back when I was with the city of San Francisco. And it was something that I was really excited to bring to Los Angeles, where the top two reasons that parents don't let their kids go play in parks are transportation and safety. So how could I bring the park to the neighborhood instead of having the neighborhood kids have to get to the park? And as you look at this map of LA, you can see immediately all of these neighborhood streets and the tremendous potential that they offer. So we started simple. They were just, again, simple plywood benches, some shade structures, and we had the community and the neighborhoods themselves be responsible for activating the space. It was another application-driven, ground-up process. We engaged a community-based organization to kind of concierge those folks through the application process, help them understand what this was. And now it's grown into this program. So this is the box of play up on the upper left-hand side. It's literally a playground in a box. Those lightweight plastic structures are called the wobble. And we have shade sails and umbrellas and these very simple street closure devices that any community can apply for and use in their neighborhood. These structures, the wobble, you can stack them together and make a giant rocking chair. You can break them apart and have them be horses or spaceships or whatever your imagination allows. You can stack them up and make a fort. They have holes in them where you can put umbrellas in place because shade is an equity issue in Los Angeles. Low-income neighborhoods, Black and brown neighborhoods have significantly less shade than their more affluent, whiter peers on the west side of Los Angeles. So we knew shade was important. And this program has been a tremendous success. One of the women who was a key partner for us in Boyle Heights, in the Boyle Heights Play Street, said on the day of the play streets that even the cholos get involved. They come out, they take off their colors, they bring out basketball hoops, and I don't know of another $10,000 project that gets you that kind of return on investment in a community. So we launched Vision Zero, which is a really important moment in Los Angeles at this time. Vision Zero, I know Milwaukee is considering it. It is meant to really create a data-driven approach to traffic safety. What we found, we looked at our data, is that 6% of our streets account for 2/3 of the severe and fatal crashes. What we found in our data is that while only 10 or 12% of the crashes, the total crashes, involve people biking and walking, about half of the deaths are people biking and walking, the most vulnerable residents that we have. And half of what we call our high injury network of those streets where we have the highest number of people getting injured and killed are in communities of concern, communities that have experienced decades of disinvestment and that they are largely low-income communities, communities with large immigrant populations, and communities of color. So we had our map and we began to bring our sort of community-driven approach to building out projects. This is Reseda in Northridge, near Cal State Northridge. We put in the city's first parking protected bike lane with green paint. Side note, this is LA, and so we have a unique shade of green that the film industry had to approve of so that it didn't disrupt their filming. In this case, we also worked with a nonprofit architecture firm to try and bring more to this business district. We improved the facades. You can see we brought these yellow street furniture and bike racks to try and give this place an identity. We used paint creatively on the sidewalk to give it a different feel and a different kind of texture, while at the same time trying to tackle the safety problem that this street was experiencing by slowing down the street through this redesign. That project went well. So we marched over to Venice in the west side of LA, and we thought we would do the same thing. This is Venice Boulevard. It was a former streetcar line. You can tell that because of how wide it is. We worked with the community to do a temporary build out of another parking protected bike lane that would remove a lane of traffic in both directions and some parking spaces. You can see it was a great day, tremendous success, 3 years of outreach, a lot of work. We put in the project. We thought it looked amazing. We thought it looked incredible. We were so excited. It's about a mile long. And then we started seeing some significant blowback. And any community that begins down this path will have this moment. It was Prospect Park in New York City. It was Polk Street in San Francisco. For us, it was Venice Boulevard in Mar Vista. And, you know, this uproar that we encountered that became highly political was a setback. And it was a moment where we had to take a deep breath and decide whether or not we were going to keep going. And we decided that we would keep going and that the way that we would re-emerge and restart our work was with things that we knew were really already powerful and successful. Things like walk to school projects, Vision Zero for Youth, things like, again, working with artists. This is an intersection on Hoover in LA, East LA. That pennant tells you the number of people who've been injured or killed. The stencil on the ground gives you more information. We worked with luchadores in around Westlake and MacArthur Park to try and continue to telegraph to people and change their perception about who the street is for and what's happening on our streets, specifically focused on students and kids. And we worked with kids themselves. These are middle schoolers from historic Filipino town, bringing their version of Suavecito, slow jams to their street. These kinds of interventions are, again, they're low cost. They're about building community will. They're about building coalitions. They're about recovering from you know, the setback that we experienced in West LA. They're about rebuilding the morale of the staff at LADOT who work on these projects from their heart, who care deeply about them. We brought our scramble crosswalks to Westlake, another series of 3 intersections in a row where we were able to really achieve tremendous safety outcomes. So we just didn't give up, because the best antidote to one of those moments, and if you are lucky enough to see one of those moments, keep going, because what's on the other side is tremendous change. And we just kept building projects. This is Avalon in South LA. We kept doing outreach. We kept working. We kept our cost-effective and simple approach. And we built towards bigger projects. This is Spring Street in downtown LA. This is our first 2-way bike lane on Spring Street and Main Street, 1-way couplets that run through downtown LA. And we built bigger projects. This is Figueroa that runs 4 miles through South LA and downtown LA. We began to introduce concrete components. We began to introduce work on bus-only lanes and bring another Hollywood approved red color into our bus lanes to improve the way that they operated. And these projects have really, they're in an arc. They're part of a whole story, and people's willingness to see that taking some risks in other parts of the city paid off have become one of our most powerful tools to keep businesses afloat during the pandemic. This is an image from our alfresco program, where we've removed 800 parking spaces around the city in order to allow restaurants and small businesses to spill out into them and to use them for different purposes. So this is what it looks like. This is, you know, during the pandemic, we've gotten about 100 miles of bike lanes and bus lanes, 3,000 alfresco installations across the city, including in parking lots and on the sidewalk, 50 miles of slow streets, which are similar to play streets, but have a slightly lighter touch of actual engagement. And we've kind of coalesced around this idea of universal basic mobility. So this idea that no matter who you are, no matter where you live, you have access to frequent, affordable transportation that can get you where you need to go. And we acknowledge that driving has to be a part of that. So while we can set the table with our street design, we have to layer in services on top of it to give people choices who don't currently have them. So this is Blue LA, our electric vehicle car sharing program. This is Metro Bike, our bike sharing program that we launched back in 2017, I think. We've now converted much of the fleet to electric bikes, which get about 10 times more ridership than the regular bikes because they're super fun to ride. And we've begun to convert our bus fleet as well to electrification. And we've really opened the city up to other forms of mobility like microtransit and electric bikes and scooters. So really, our program is about getting, more grandmas on skateboards and more kids making it home to their families every night. It's about more businesses being able to stay afloat, mom and pop businesses and small businesses. It's about people loving their streets and loving their city. Thank you. So I'm happy to take questions at this point. I think we have a little bit of time for that. And I know that Carissa wanted to make sure that we made space for that. And I see, I'll open up the Q&A. So as you're sort of, listening to me answer this question, if you have other questions, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A. So I rented a bike in LA and rode 50 miles all over the city. It's a great biking city, but the distances are so vast. How do you connect the dots to help people traverse long distances in areas not well served by transit? So this is a great question. And it's one that I really struggled with because the city I had worked in before coming to LA was San Francisco. San Francisco is a 49 square mile city. And it is much easier to get around. And what I decided is that most people are not actually going to get on their bike and bike 20 miles to work every day. And so my focus instead should be on those neighborhood scale trips. So, and actually the numbers bear this out, that about 75% of the trips that are made in the city of Los Angeles are under 5 miles. That is a perfect biking length for people who are able to use a bike or an adaptive bike. And so breaking things down to the neighborhood scale and thinking more about, the family that wants to go ride their bikes to breakfast on the weekend, or the kids that want to ride their bikes to a couple blocks over to see their friends, or the parents that want to ride their bike to the neighborhood bar, or the neighborhood restaurant for date night. Those trips, focusing on those trips actually leads you to a really different solution set than focusing on really long commuting trips. It sort of shifts your focus to, how could I create some neighborhood greenways here? How could I focus on these residential and lower volume streets that need just a little bit of extra help in order to make them really bikeable? And that extra help can look like resurfacing them so they have smoother pavement. It can look like flipping stop signs so that if you're on a bike and you're on the neighborhood greenway, you kind of have the right of way. It can look like little neighborhood traffic circles that have planters in the middle of them. And what the research also tells us is that in the United States, women usually comprise about 25% of the people who are biking in a city. And the reason for that is that when you look at women's preferences for bicycle riding, women prefer lower volume, lower speed streets. And they are willing to go out of their way and take a more circuitous route if they can use those streets or off-street paths rather than the main arterial. This is not me telling you not to build bike lanes on arterials. You definitely have to do that. But it is me telling you, open up the thinking about who you're serving, what trips you're serving, and what their preferences might be. And the other rule of thumb for sort of a safe systems approach as part of Vision Zero is that the greater the traffic turbulence, the higher the speed, the higher the volume, the greater the separation you need for people who are on foot or on bike. So a lot of times I wonder what our streets would look like if, entities like OSHA were in charge of them, right? If a person who's responsible for safety, say in a factory, was responsible for safety on our streets, they would never allow the unprotected human to be so close to the 2-ton steel vehicle moving at 40 miles an hour. Their focus would be slowing that vehicle down and giving that human as much separation and buffering as possible. So Mike is asking, can you expand on, I mentioned joy, can you expand on that and its importance? So that's a great question. So, when a lot of my own personal experience in doing this work in San Francisco, and before that, when I was a consultant working in cities across the Western United States, is that, the feeling that you get from attending a community meeting to talk about a bike lane or a new pedestrian curb extension or a bus lane is not typically joy. Nobody really arrives at that meeting feeling joy. Nobody leaves that meeting feeling joy. So how could I infuse the community outreach process itself with more joy? And what that looked like was bringing in artists, was playing with interesting materials, and actually, instead of having a community meeting in a library, having a temporary build out of the project itself. It was also about layering in other services and other things that people were interested in. For Avalon in South LA, for example, we brought in many community-based organizations and nonprofits, and whose focus is helping people to get loans to achieve home ownership. Or there was a job fair component, or there were health screenings, and there was a coffee truck, and there was a food truck, and there was a community bike ride, and there was a band. Those kinds of things, bringing those into the community process is important, and then bringing them into the project work itself. Seeing an open streets project like Ciclovia as infrastructure that delivers on community joy. We bring that actual metric into the way that we evaluate the success of our projects. There's a public realm survey developed by a guy named Jan Gell that doesn't really ask like how many more people are riding in the bike lane. It asks how many more strangers are having spontaneous positive interactions, how many friends are meeting, and how much longer are they staying on a street after you put in your project. The research that gets repeated, I've seen it from the Netherlands, I've also seen it from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, is that people associate biking and walking with joy, and they associate other modes with anger and aversion. So, our goal is to deliver more joy. Then, that's the direction that we need to head in. But we can't just hope that we, bring people joy against their will. We have to bring that into everything we do from the community process itself. The next question is about land use. So LA has a massive urban sprawl problem. How do you ensure that all neighborhoods have access to transportation or other public options? How do you make sure no community or neighborhood is being left behind? And there's two really important points embedded in this question. One is land use and transportation need to be really close friends. They have to be homies. The director of city planning refers to me as his work wife. We're both happily married, not to each other, but that's how we talk about each other, because land use and transportation are inextricably linked. They are interdependent, and transportation often has to bear the burden of policy failures in other sectors, including our sort of American land use fascination with keeping uses entirely separate, which is how we got our sort of sprawling form that we have now. So we do bring into almost everything we do, every program we regulate, every program we deliver, including Vision Zero, has uses the Cal Enviro screen or other equity metrics that are specifically focused on racial equity and socioeconomic equity to ensure that there is overinvestment by those private companies and by the city itself into communities that have experienced disinvestment. That's not enough just to deliver the money. And I'll say that, you know, Vision Zero itself, because half of those streets are in low income communities. And when we set up a prioritization and a ranking for what we're going to build when, by definition, we're going to go into those communities first because there are inherent inequities where people are getting injured and killed in the city. But it is not enough just to bring money because the lived experience of the people in those communities is that their freedom of movement is entirely inhibited, not just by the fact that the street feels fast and unsafe, but because they have felt policed out of public spaces, or they have other fears, anxieties, and worries about walking down the street that have resulted from decades of flawed and overtly racist policies in most places. And that is work. What that means is that I can't have a really smart planner sit at LADOT and come up with an amazing GIS map that has an incredibly complex prioritization schema that gives us, you know, the answer for where we've been not investing in communities. It means that I have to actually do the hard work of investing in community-based organizations and partners that are already in the community, working with the community. So our pre-qualified bench of consultants no longer just includes engineering firms, planning firms. It includes those community-based organizations. And we frequently put out calls to them to make sure that our outreach is culturally appropriate, that it is context sensitive, and that we get real answers about what kinds of investments are needed in those places. On the private side, what we found is that government has to be involved. So that low-income EV car sharing program did include community-based organizations on an advisory task force from the very beginning, advising on the RFP, the price of service, the use cases that needed to be served. That was critical. But if we had not invested public dollars into that program, it would have gone to the west side of Los Angeles, to Santa Monica, to other high-income, high-trip neighborhoods. It would not have gone to Westlake and South LA. And it really is the public sector's responsibility to acknowledge that we have to invest in those kinds of programs the same way that we are investing in transit service. So next up, love the connection between arts and culture and transportation projects. How do you make the case to more traditional planners and engineers that integrating arts and culture is an important part of projects? Great question, Kate. If I had an easy answer for you, I would share it. But the real answer is that I am a longtime arts and culture nerd. I'm a theater kid from way back, and that the general manager for the Department of Cultural Affairs got confirmed by the city council on the same day I did. And so we were fast friends from the very, very beginning. And what I discovered is that my department's budget, while it's, woefully small for the scope of the problem and the scope of the city, it's huge compared to hers. And so from the very beginning, we collaborated and schemed up, simple ways to bring arts and culture into the work. So bringing back Broadway's dress rehearsal, that first project with the drop-down murals and the poetry, that was really a Department of Cultural Affairs project funded by the Department of Transportation. So $40,000 to bring us all kinds of interventions along the whole street. There were performers and puppeteers, there were art installations, temporary murals, permanent murals, those, and that investment, when you think about the millions of dollars that came back over time in the economic investment in that corridor, that's a screaming deal. And so so then we decided we would actually bring an artist in residence to the Department of Transportation. And we've had an artist in residence at DOT now for the last 5 years. Another very small investment to do the thing that you're talking about, to actually begin to have that be part of a traditional sort of planning or engineering design process. And our first artist in residence, one of the very first things he did was actually to take an oral history of the department. It was a really smart way to both capture our own history and also begin to build trust with folks who were really skeptical and suspicious about what this artist in residence thing was going to mean for them, AKA, is this just more work for me? So it was being strategic about how that began to be introduced into the department itself. And the next question, it seems when city leaders see these projects, they think dollar signs. Can you speak to the relationship between costs and the culture of safer streets? And that's from Caressa. So another great question. And, you know, transportation finance is not really well understood by most folks. And that's because it's complex and counterintuitive and weird. You know, most people who ride bikes also drive cars, and so they pay the gas tax just like the rest of us. But I still hear people ask, you know, when are bicyclists going to pay for their fair share of whatever project it is? What I discovered actually when I took a closer look, because you can talk all you want about the costs of projects, but what is the cost of not doing the project? Because when we looked at all of our crash data and we looked over 10 years of data, the trends were stubborn and consistent. We know that every year we do nothing, we are going to see somebody get injured and killed on these, you know, 450 miles of streets in LA. And what is the cost of those crashes? As it turns out, those crashes are incredibly expensive. Federal Highway Administration has assigned a cost to the crashes that occur on our streets, to the severe and fatal crashes that happen. And furthermore, what we also know is that about 2/3 of the costs of the care associated with people who experience traumatic brain injury or other forms of severe medical outcomes are borne by Medicare and Medicaid. What that means is these are societal costs. There are costs associated with doing a project. There are absolutely costs associated with not doing the project. Now, as a person who goes through a budget process every year, I understand very clearly that those two pots of money are not the same. It's not like you can just go to Medicare and Medicaid and take millions of dollars and invest it in, you know, building a safer street so that they don't have to incur those costs in the first place. But what it is very powerful for is storytelling and coalition building and advocacy. So, you know, as you think about all of the places that your city invests in transportation, whether that's resurfacing streets, repairing sidewalks, putting in new traffic signals, making traffic signal timing adjustments, and the dozens and hundreds of small decisions made by engineers and planners across the city every single day, those are all opportunities to do things differently. When an engineer is looking at the turning radius that a developer is proposing as part of their, you know, improvements that they're making in the street, that is an opportunity to put in a safer corner. So rather than using a turning radius where cars can go still 30 miles an hour because you want to accommodate the occasional large vehicle, how could you tighten that up so that drivers are moving at a safer speed? We know that drivers who are going under 20 miles an hour, who if you get hit by somebody going under 20 miles an hour, your chances of surviving that crash are significantly higher than if that driver is going 30 miles an hour or above. You know, 8 out of 10 people will walk away from that slower crash unscathed. 8 out of 10 people will not survive that faster crash. So don't just think about the cost of doing new projects, think about the cost of doing business today and how you might do it slightly differently. Because, you know, what I found in the culture at DOT is that, you know, these are engineers who they would say that their life's work is safety too, just like I do. But the branding of Vision Zero, it felt to them like we were disavowing all of their focus on safety. And so it was important also to help them to understand that that was not the case, that we were trying to lift up that part of their work and infuse them with more interesting ways to solve the same problems to get different results. So I would say that's how I would respond to that question, but it's a tough one. You know, most places don't have money lying around to do this kind of work, but it also doesn't have to be that expensive. Next question is, how can Milwaukee get past creating low quality bike infrastructure that many users still won't feel comfortable using? When and how will we create infrastructure that is truly acceptable to all ages and abilities? I don't know if that's really a question for me because I don't fully know, you know, what y'all are designing and don't completely understand and can't speak to the specific sort of resistance or challenges that you're perceiving. But I will say this, in LA at least, you know, I had come from the city of San Francisco where we had engineers that actually wrote the NACTO bike guide, right? So I was very spoiled in that I had engineers that had spent many, many years creating a new kind of American bike infrastructure really from the ground up. And they had to take a lot of thoughtful risks to do that, which is very scary when you are a licensed engineer and your engineering stamp is really your livelihood. What I found in LA is that the engineers knew they needed to do something differently. They could see that the infrastructure they were building wasn't really working. And so I did a couple things. One is I put all of them on bikes and I took them up to San Francisco and I rode them down Market Street so they could feel for themselves, what does it feel like to be in an unbuffered bike lane? And then what does it feel like to be in a bike lane that's buffered with paint? And then what does it feel like to be in a bike lane that's buffered with concrete? And then the second thing I needed to do was to bring in expertise. These folks didn't necessarily have the training on how to do this design. This is not a technically simple thing to do. It doesn't have to be expensive, but that doesn't mean it's not easy. It's easy. You know, adjusting signal timing, trying to navigate the peculiarities of every individual street when you need to put in something like a protected bike lane and make signal timing changes or even add bike signals at signalized intersections. So we invested in through one of our projects, we added a professional development budget to the cost of the project itself and brought in a consulting firm that actually delivered training to these engineers and that was able to provide over-the-shoulder reviews of the designs that the engineers were creating. So I needed to invest in training the workforce because it wasn't necessarily a philosophical resistance. Many of them had not actually been on a bike for 30 years, so they didn't really understand and experience what it was like to be in a regular bike lane versus a protected lane. And they also then, even if they did that, they didn't feel totally confident in that they had the expertise necessary to design the facilities themselves. Okay, so I know I have 3 minutes. And I will say, let's see, I'm going to take maybe one more question. And I see there are a few more in the chat. So I think if I don't get to all of them, I'm happy to provide answers so that you can have them when the conference is finished. So the next question is about, I wonder if you could please speak a little more on equity and how it's operationalized into prioritizing projects and programming investments. Great. So I will take Vision Zero as an example. So year 1, Vision Zero, we went out and mapped our what we call our high injury network. And this is a combination of art and science, because what you'll see when you pull up your little push pin map of crashes where people are getting injured and killed is that they don't necessarily snap into corridor projects in the way that we would think about projects. Or because the data sets are relatively small, it's difficult to discern trends at any individual intersection. So you have to sort of take a look and see, okay, I can actually see that this entire street looks like it's just sort of confettied with crashes. And so maybe I need to deal with the entire street. So that was step one, was getting the network. Step two was layering in some of those other socioeconomic and demographic factors to try and understand what was happening around those streets. It quickly became obvious that half of the streets were in low-income communities of concern. And so then we had 450 miles of streets. We did not have money to do 450 miles of streets. So we needed to come up with our sort of priority corridors. And the way that we did that was to bring in an additional weighting for streets that were in communities where the department had not been investing over several years, based on a lot of factors that we had in the CalEnviro screen and in what's called the Community Health Atlas, which is a measurement of public health. Once we came up with those priority corridors, we made a decision that we wanted to focus on quick build, cost-effective projects and spread around our limited funding like peanut butter. So the first year in our budget, we had about $600,000 for Vision Zero. This year's budget, we have $64 million for Vision Zero. So it grew over time. It was definitely a long game. But that first year, we have 250 people who get injured, who get killed on our streets every year. And we knew how much projects cost. So we focused on light touch, quick build projects. We spread it around as much as we could. That was phase one. Then phase two, we came back with traffic signals. Phase three, we come back with concrete and true complete streets, because that gives us the 3 years necessary to assemble grants, write the grants, get the grants, and then build the projects. But from the very beginning, you know, we weighted all of that prioritization through, you know, measured against racial equity specifically. I'll say one last thing, which is in our scooter program, what we found is that we put in a lot of incentives for private companies to provide scooters to low-income Black and Brown neighborhoods. Incentives weren't enough. We now, in our next iteration, now have requirements for those companies to put their fleets in those neighborhoods. And we measured equity in two ways. One is a straight up look at the factors that I mentioned. Where are low-income Angelenos? Where are Black and Brown Angelenos? The second, layered on top of that, is where do we have transportation deserts? So where do we have places that are served poorly by existing transit, rail, or anything else, where there's really no other way to get around? And taking those two factors together, we require companies to deploy a percentage of their fleet in those locations if they want access to Hollywood, Venice, and downtown LA. And we also require them to invest in outreach with community-based organizations, specifically to fund those organizations to go do that work. And we require them invest in an infrastructure fund so that we can actually build out some of the projects where we have the largest number of people who are riding dockless bikes and scooters, and the largest number of people who are getting injured and killed from our Vision Zero data. And that's it. I think I'm out of time.
Salita, thank you so much for being with us. Your energy is off the charts, and I just love being around you, even in this virtual space, and I'm sure many of us do too. So everyone, we are actually going to take a little bit of a break, and we're going to come back with our first session. Gosh, Salita, thank you again. Can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much for having me.
I will be actually moderating the first session, so hang tight.